Hello, it's Jacob again, and in this video, we'll be talking about fiscal policy, the first of our two approaches to trying to manage recessions. Now, in the last set of lectures, we saw Keynes's explanation of why business cycles happen. We understand that recessions cause unemployment, falling wages, and other suffering. And so if we could, we would like to cut recession short. We would like to have some way to either prevent them from happening or to end them quicker than the market can do by itself. Because even though markets do equilibrate, even though a recession will eventually end by itself, this is one situation where it may actually be possible for people to beat the market. With the economic calculation problem, we saw that any attempt to centrally plan individual markets would tend to fail because the information gathering and analysis and implementation of a bureaucrat will just never keep pace with the decentralization of a market economy. But here, it may be possible to do it faster than the market could when we're talking about a macroeconomic level. Now, both fiscal policy and monetary policy prioritize manipulating aggregate demand to counteract short-term shocks. They have essentially the same goal. Like I ended with you in the last video, the idea really does boil down to just the aggregate demand moved, can we move it back? But they're going to do this through different means. With monetary policy, the focus is on manipulating the money supply. Whereas with fiscal policy, the focus is on manipulating demand directly through taxes and government spending. Essentially, understanding that any growth in spending must come from a corresponding increase in the money supply, and vice versa, we know that we can use either. It's like we have two different levers we can pull, but they both have the same effect. Now, monetary policy is going to be conducted by central banks, which in the US, we call our central bank the Federal Reserve. Whereas fiscal policy is going to be conducted by legislatures, which in the United States would be Congress. And the reason why this is done by Congress is that Congress has what's called power of the purse. They set taxes and they set spending. This is something that comes from our tradition of English politics, the rights of Englishmen. It's often forgotten about nowadays, but most of what the founding fathers were fighting for in their own day was rights that Englishmen had back home and that the British were just refusing to recognize in the colonies. And one of those was a principle that any citizen or subject of the king had the right to have a say in their own taxation. It would be unjust to confiscate somebody's property, to steal from them without asking for their permission. And at a social level, this takes place through representative institutions, whether it be a Congress or Parliament. But yeah, this is something maybe you learned it in high school civics, maybe you didn't, but the president does not tax you, and he doesn't control his own budget. All of that comes from Congress. Often you'll hear people will basically, they'll credit everything in the world to the current president, whether it's good or bad. The president can negotiate on behalf of his party. He can veto stuff he doesn't like. And he can effectively create law through what's called executive orders, where he gives orders to the regulatory agencies, and then the regulatory agencies are empowered by Congress to pass certain laws that apply to whatever specific thing they're in charge of. Like, say, the EPA with pollution, the ATF with alcohol, tobacco, and firearms. But anyways, always think Congress when I'm talking about this. Now, we'll deal with fiscal policy first because it's straightforward. This stuff really is easy. Now, a recession is caused by aggregate demand falling. And the recession also causes disinflation by itself. Deflation if it's harsh enough, if, the price level actually goes down. And in the long term, neutrality of money means the short run aggregate supply will shift so you're back at equilibrium. But the problem is that takes time. You're telling me in the long run, everything will be fixed. And as Keynes quipped, in the long run, we're all dead. So, how can we get there a little quicker? And Keynes's proposal, one of his two ways of doing this, right, is what if we could raise spending, whether by, say, spending more money through the government or by giving more money back to the public to spend? So if spending fell by a certain amount, let's just get that back up to where we want it to be. And this is called a stimulus, as in a stimulus bill, like the very infamous one from the 2008 Great Recession, or as in a stimulus check, like the very infamous checks that so many people got during COVID apocalypse. I think I've used that phrase before. I like to call it COVID apocalypse. It's my little tongue-in-cheek. I get pissed when I start to think about the COVID times. Never gonna forget that. Anyhow, it falls, so we just need to pump more spending in to get it back to where it was. And what's this going to do? Well, it is going to raise inflation. There's no way around that. You're spending more money. That's going to require there to be more money, say more loans from the banks or the government just printing it up. It's going to raise inflation, but ideally it raises the inflation just back to what it was. And you end the recession faster. And another way you can do this too is by cutting taxes. If you cut taxes, that frees up more money for the public, as long as the government doesn't cut its spending, right? Cutting taxes, running a budget deficit will also accomplish this. Now, how effective fiscal policy is going to be depends on two multipliers, like our money multiplier that we've already discussed. And both of these are consequences of the paradox of thrift. That idea that when you spend money, that money is someone else's income. And so if people start to save, it can actually end up hurting the economy overall. Now, just like a bank creating money out of thin air through loans, when you spend $1, you end up creating more than $1 in new trade. And the spending multiplier is going to be the total amount, right? The total scalar that determines how much new commerce there is. So for example, John pays Jane $1. Jane decides to save 20% of it, and she pays Jim 80 cents. Then Jim pays Justin 30 cents. Now, if these were the 3 transactions we have over a given period, then the initial change in spending is $1. But the total amount of spending by the end is $2.10. Just by John spending that $1, he's actually created $2.10 in extra commerce. Because the income he creates ends up being used to pay for other people's goods. And so it stimulates more commerce. It stimulates more economic activity. And we would say that the spending multiplier is 2.1. Now, since taxes take away income from people, they do the exact same thing as the spending multiplier, just in reverse. If you take $1 away from John, he can't pay Jane, who then can't spend 80 cents on Jim, and so on and so forth. The spending multiplier and the tax multiplier are kind of the same thing. Now, if you were paying attention during Unit 2, you might remember that there was also a deadweight loss from the imposition of a tax. And that goes beyond just taking the dollar away from John. So you might expect that the true tax multiplier is often going to be larger. If you're taxing John's income, then if you don't spend the money as the government, if you just take a dollar from him and then throw it in a state safe somewhere and ignore it, it's not in circulation, it's not chasing after goods, and so it isn't affecting prices. Well, if you do that, then not only have you removed a dollar from him, but if John also chooses to work less because of it, well, there's the deadweight loss as well. So yeah, tax multipliers are generally going to be a lot nastier than spending multipliers. Which also means that not necessarily from a standpoint of the budget deficit, but just in terms of the efficiency of this, we're usually going to expect tax cuts to be more effective than government spending. Now, how are these multipliers going to help us with our fiscal policy? Well, what they tell us is that we don't have to lift the aggregate demand by the entire amount that it fell. We only have to do it part of the way because the multiplier is going to carry it the rest of the way. And you see an example of that in your little graph at the bottom. Here you see that aggregate demand fell, right? Consumption spending fell by this full amount. The government comes in and it does a stimulus. In this case, it seems that they're the ones spending the money. They're increasing spending instead of cutting taxes. And they increase it by that much, but there's a bit of a spending multiplier. When the government spends the money, it creates income for people who go on to spend that money themselves. And so that creates just a little bit of extra consumption that pushes it back to where it should be. How big these multipliers are going to be is going to depend on what the industry is, who it is that you're targeting. For example, old people don't tend to spend as much of their income. And this is largely because, now when I say old people, I do mean more well-to-do old folks, not ones living on like Social Security. They don't tend to spend as much of their income because they're near the end of their life. They often are coasting off of retirement and pensions and whatnot. They're more reluctant to part with a dollar that they're not sure they're going to be able to replace. And so you would expect a spending multiplier that targets the old to be a lot lower. You would have to have a much larger stimulus in order to carry the aggregate demand back to where it should. On the other hand, folks like, say, poor people or young people who spend a very large percentage of their income, you would expect them to have large multipliers. And this can go industry by industry too, such as when the government chooses to make certain kinds of purchases. Some industries are going to link up more with other industries. For example, does the purchase of a certain product stimulate demand for many different kinds of resources instead of just for a few specific resources? When the government decides to, say, build a road as part of a stimulus, is the concrete going to come from America or is it going to come from overseas? That would play a role in the size of the spending multiplier. And on this goes. In your textbook, you can find a particular chart where it shows the actual real-world estimates of multipliers from the 2008 stimulus. Now, Keynes wanted governments to run budget surpluses during booms so that they could run budget deficits during recessions. What do I mean by a budget surplus? Well, that just means when they take in more money than they spend, right? So that the government's coffers are filling. And likewise, a budget deficit would be when they're spending more than they take in, so that they're running up a debt, right? The national debt. Now, if you wanted, so supposing you start from a position of a balanced budget, you start from a position of taking in just enough to pay for everything that you need to pay for. How would you run a budget surplus? Well, there are two different ways you could do this. If you need to take more than you're spending, you could either reduce your spending or you could raise taxes. But in either case, this would be called contractionary fiscal policy. The government is bringing in the money, but they're not spending it. If they're not spending the money and they're not banking it either, then it's not in circulation. This is essentially a way to remove money from the system. Let's tax people and then not use it. At least not now. And so what would this do? What would it do to aggregate demand? Well, if the growth rate of the money supply is falling, if the level of spending, the growth rate of spending is falling, then that would be a negative aggregate demand shock. So when the government does this, when they raise taxes by more than they lower spending to create a budget surplus, it's going to lower aggregate demand. Likewise, let's say that they want to run a budget deficit. They want to spend more than they're bringing in. Well, the only way to do that would be to lower taxes, so less is coming in, or raise spending, so more is flowing out. And when they do this, it's all coming from either debt or from money that they print up. During COVID, for example, they basically doubled the money supply. I mean, the monetary base. They basically doubled the monetary base. Imagine twice as much physical cash floating around. When they do this, that means the money supply is going to grow, the spending level is going to grow, and hence you get a positive aggregate demand shock. And we call this expansionary fiscal policy. So you can kind of remember these as expansionary policy goes with positive demand shocks. Contractionary fiscal policy goes with negative demand shocks. The policy is going to cause a shock. We do expansionary when we want to get it up. We do contractionary when we want to lower it. And what Keynes is going to propose is that we're going to do the opposite of whatever the market is currently doing. So if it falls, if aggregate demand falls, you have the bear spirit, then we need to do expansionary fiscal policy to raise it back up. If aggregate demand is up, you have the bull in charge, then we need to do contractionary fiscal policy to lower it back down. Now, why would we ever want to lower it? Well, you do have to pay your debts one day. The taxation is like paying business cycle insurance. We reduce aggregate demand in good times so we can afford to increase it in bad times. And as, again, you might remember from Unit 2, taxation is inherently destructive. And so we know that if we do this, it's going to reduce the growth rate, but the growth rate should also be more stable and that might be a worthwhile trade-off. So Keynes sees it as that the market is kind of snaking upwards. His hope is to make it snake upwards, and it might go up more shallowly. I'm sorry, I don't think that's the real word. It might go up more shallow, but more stable. I'm sorry for the quality of the camera. It looks really weird with the camera being mirrored when I try to do my hand motions. It works so much better when the class is in person. Frankly, everything works better when the class is in person. I'd rather just teach you in person. Now, unfortunately, spending is popular, but taxation isn't. And so what happens instead is that nations just run up their public debts all the time. The main reason I bring this up is that a lot of people who study economics on their own, like self-educated in it, they tend to read a lot of like very, very libertarian stuff. And these pop econ books make it out like Keynes was just the devil and a moron. They tend to characterize him as being this money spending fanatic who believe that you could just spend your way out of every problem, and that's not true. Keynes was appalled by national debts. He was no happier with us or the British having a national debt than like Andrew Jackson was. You know, he still believed that you had to pay it back, but nobody ever wants to. You can sometimes convince people to pay higher taxes if you tell them they're going to get something in return. But imagine being a politician running for office and telling people, yeah, I'm going to charge you more and you're going to get less stuff. You're not going to win. And it doesn't matter if you're conservative or liberal. Either way, you're not going to win. Conservatives and liberals both love government spending. They just love it on different things. The US military takes up a huge amount of the government's budget. Welfare takes up a huge amount of the government's budget. And between the two of them, they choke out just about everything else. You know, people often like to whine about things like NASA. My dad hates NASA. Yeah, I care quite a bit about the space race, so it's painful to me to listen to him. But he hates NASA. A lot of people hate foreign aid. NASA and foreign aid is like less than 1% of your federal budget. Now, before Keynes, it was common for governments to prioritize the national debt above all else. And so when they would get recessions, what they would see is that their tax revenues were falling, right? The economy is getting smaller, so there's less taxes to raise from it. And they would often react with what sounded like a very reasonable idea. Let's cut our spending. Usually they wouldn't raise taxes because it's pretty obvious that when the economy is struggling, you don't want to make life even harder for normal people. But they lower spending as a way to ensure that they didn't go into budget deficit. And this kind of contractionary fiscal policy run in response to a recession is called austerity. And it's very popular on the right wing with conservative types because it can often be pitched through an analogy to personal finance and through a sort of moralistic language. We all understand that in our own personal lives, our income and our spending levels are essentially unrelated to each other in the short term. If you spend more money, that doesn't make you richer. Your income doesn't go up. Likewise, if your income goes up, it doesn't mean that you have to spend more or less. And so, if a person wants to maximize their well-being over time, they're generally best off spending no more than they bring in. Because, of course, borrowing ultimately impoverishes you. There are times when it makes sense to borrow, such as for investments. But for the most part, it's a trap for fools. The issue is that this kind of logic breaks down at the societal level. For a culture that does not really have an understanding of economics, it's very natural to think in terms of the country as being like a giant family, and that the budget should be managed with the same sort of approach that you would manage a family budget. But the issue is that the government's spending level and its income level are directly related because of the spending and the tax multiplier. If they lower spending, then it lowers the tax revenues, because by not spending that money, that means that they did not create income for other people who would have spent that money. There's less for the government to take. And in a particularly extreme case, the spending multiplier could be so harsh that it actually lowers government revenue overall. You lower spending, and yet the budget deficit grows because lowering the spending destroys so much extra commerce that you're not able to tax now. What Keynes realized was that this austerity was making recessions worse. And it was also making booms worse, too. Governments in hard times would tend to tighten their belt. That's a bit of that moralistic language. They would tighten their belt, cut back on spending, prioritize the good of the government over that of society as a whole, and in doing so, they would deepen the recession by denying their business to people that need it more than ever. And so recessions become more extreme. And you can see that on this graph here. The blue curve, right? The blue curve is a normal business cycle if the government wasn't doing anything at all. Red is with a common sense, right? Common sense policy, where the government thinks like an individual household. Because they lower spending, because they run contractionary fiscal policy, not only do you get the negative aggregate demand shock from the market, but now you're heaping on another negative aggregate demand shock. And so the downswing is even harsher, even worse. Now, the flip side of this is that oftentimes during a period of economic growth, a government will be a little more permissive, just like we are in our own lives. People would say, "Oh, well, we can afford to tax or to spend more because there's so many extra resources," and this would make the booms even harsher. So you wind up with a business cycle that's a lot more chaotic. Instead of that, it's more like that. Imagine something more like a heartbeat monitor. Well, Keynes, he's stepping in and he's saying, no, 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 no. Your conventional wisdom, the way that you've been running finances in most Western countries for most of history, is completely backwards. Because you have to think in terms of the economy as a whole, not just the treasury. And when you think in terms of the economy as a whole, you're wanting to counteract what the economy does. So if the economy is contracting, we need to help it expand. Times are getting tough. You don't need to tighten your belt. You need to let your belt out and feast. You need to get spending up so that people have jobs that they can go back to. But the flip side of this is that since the bill must eventually be paid, When you're in the good times, when you have a big boom, you need to run some contractionary policy to feed off of it. When the country is poor, the government needs to spend as though it is rich. When the country is rich, the government needs to tax as though it is poor. And in that manner, instead of having a chaotic world that's very upsetting to people, where we flip back and forth like mad between poverty and opulence, instead we can have a much more predictable and gentle business cycle.